Continental Realism and the Cold War. The world of the Cold War was propitious for the European strategic ideas that wafted into the United States in the second half of the 20th century. The international environment faced by the United States during the Cold War looked many ways like the world faced by Bismarck and Metternich. The competition between the United States and the Soviet Union could be easily constructed as a 20th century analog of the old struggles for the mastery of Europe. True, the competition was on a global scale rather than on the local scale of the European politics, but time and distance has shrunk. The United States and the Soviet Union were in many ways back to the scorpions in the bottle struggle of European politics. Moreover, the economic dimension of the US-Soviet competition, although basic and ultimately decisive, tend to disappear from the view for long periods of time. In reality, with the Western European and Japanese economic revivals of the 1950s, a success made possible largely made by the World Economic Initiatives of American foreign policy in the 1940s, the Soviet threat to the West sharply diminished. Money trumped marks. Communism had little appeal in an increasingly affluent West. Economics again visibly drove international politics in the waning years of Soviet power. The communist regime ultimately crumbled as its increasingly economic shortcomings, including its ability to match Western technological advances, undermined the legitimacy of its social order, even in the eyes of the communist elite, increasingly put the cause of military parity with the United States out of reach. These decisive economic developments occupied with the center of policymaker decision only in the opening and closing phases of the Cold War during the long middle passages of the 40-year rivalry. The tensions largely focused on the military and political aspects of the rivalry, and for these questions, Continental Realism seemed to provide an adequate intellectual and political framework. Meanwhile, other factors largely unrelated to the US-USSR rivalry helped make the Continental Realism look more plausible in the United States by concealing the economic context of the traditional American policy, both from the elite and mass audience. This process began with a shift in the U.S. international position from the debtor to creditor status early in the 20th century, gained force with the breakdown of the Britain-based international system of finance and trade between 1914 and the Great Depression, and climaxed after World War II. The status of the United States as a debtor, capital important nation was one of the great determining factors of existence during the late 18th and through the 19th century. Virtually every American business and household was kept constantly aware of its connection to and dependence on the international financial system, and attitudes towards Britain and towards the external world generally were shaped to a significant degree by the effects of this dependency and the resentment and multiple inconveniences it caused. All this changed in the 20th century. During World War I, Britain became thoroughly and massively indebted to the United States and proved to be normally less punctilious debtor than the United States had been. By the time of the Depression was full in swing, Britain had, in essence, defaulted on its $4 billion official war debt to the United States. The default was caused by the substantial American ill feeling, but more profound consequences of the change of the financial fortune in the 20th century was a change of American psychology and politics. Foreign investors were no longer seen as powerful and uncountable forces shaping the American economy as they please, regardless of the consequences for the ordinary American farmers, workers, and small businessmen. The Federal Reserve System was now in charge of the American interest rates. Britain had nothing to do with it. A few events show the growing independence of American financial markets from Europe more clearly than do very different reactions on Wall Street to the outbreaks of the two world wars. In 1914 and 1939, on July the 31st, 1914, trading on Wall Street stopped with the outbreak of hostilities and did not resume fully for 8 months. 25 years later, when Europeans rushed off to the slaughterhouses again, neither the outbreak of hostilities nor even the fall of France closed the New York Stock Exchange for a single second. During the Cold War, the American financial markets were even more independent of the European developments. Given both the Depression and World War II further disrupted the fabric of international trade and investment already badly damaged by World War I, the early years of the Cold War saw the economic independence of the United States for the rest of the world sink to the lowest point. If it has now been more than a century since the United States faced what was once a common feature of economic life, a deep destructive recession caused by high interest rates demanded by exacting foreign creditors. Although Americans have become more aware of the influence of the international economy on their own prosperity than they were between 1945 and the economic firestorm of the early 1970s, we still do not follow the news of foreign markets with a sense of helpless dependency that our ancestors often knew. Only a OPEC ability to disrupt American economy through the oil price shocks today give us a faint sense of overwhelming, frustrating, and apparently arbitrary power that foreigners once had over the living standards of ordinary Americans. Financial independence changed the way Americans thought about foreign policy. As the foreign dimension of economic policy debates diminished in the 20th century, so too did the broad public understanding that American forward depends on the conditions of the international markets. As this understanding was lost, foreign policy became disconnected from important domestic political battles in the present, but also imaginatively in the past. Educated opinion remember Bryan's declamation against the crucifixion on the cross of gold, but forgot his linkage of the issue to the power of Britain and the question of American policy towards it. Foreign competition, as well as foreign creditors, were largely disappeared after World War II. During the most of the Cold War, the United States faced no serious economic competitor, much less a true rival anywhere in the world. Germany and Japan lay in ruin. Britain, once mighty empire, was gone. And unlike any other great power rivals in the past, the Soviet Union never posed an international commercial or financial challenge until the 70s, when Germany and especially Japanese technology threatened to challenge the American lead in key industries. American corporations were better managed and better capitalized and better equipped than almost all their rivals. The old economic order, which a large number of leading economies of roughly equivalent size and technological sophistication composed in the markets around the world, seemed lost forever. All these forces acting together and contributed to a sea change in the way that many Americans looked at foreign policy. They came, in other words, to share the outlook of Continental Realism on the relative unimportance of economic issues in international affairs. Once the American people have forgotten the way that international economic forces have once driven domestic politics, the myth of the virginal isolation entombed within the myth of the Cold War looked very plausible. Once economic issues dropped out of the history of American foreign policy diminished from a major obsession in 19th century American politics into an occasional hobby. Judging only by the importance of political and military issues, American involvement in world affairs throughout the 19th century looked, without too much squinting, to be just as episodic and marginal as the myth of the Cold War said it was. The intimacy and the horribly nature of the security threats of the Cold War era also enforced the idea that a virginal, isolated United States had come of age in a dangerous world. The looming menace of the Soviet Union, still wrapped in the prestige of the Red Army military decisive contest against the Nazi Germany, emboldened by the growing nuclear capacity and the ominous rambling from communist China, were new kinds of threats for Americans, as was the experience leading the fight for the world order as opposed to fighting in Britain's shadow. The United States have moved from being one great power of many in a relatively benign climate of Pax Americana to a position of global hegemony at the time of profound international political crisis and under the unprecedented shadow of a thermonuclear war. James Buchanan and Grover Cleveland never faced anything like this. Other factors also contributed to the rise of Continental Realism in the United States during the Cold War. From the Great Depression through World War II, the Cold War, the federal government steadily became larger, more powerful, and more secretive. With the burgeoning government, power flowed from away from Congress towards what became known as the Imperial Presidency. A culture of security clearance and classified data grew up in what had once been the most open capital in the world, and the presidents of the United States, who once traveled virtually without pomp, now never left the home without a contingent of bodyguards that would embarrass a Caesar. The United States was, in other words, looking more and more like the old imperial states of continental Europe, at least as far as the concentration of power in the executive went. Most foreign policy professionals thought this was a good idea. Congress, a theoretical co-equal branch of government whose role in foreign policy had been designed by the founding fathers, was considered to be an interfering busybody by diplomats of a new dispensation. The funny-dubby founders, in their isolation, had argued that the Cold Warriors signal that failed to design a constitution suitable for a great power. The domestic legislation of the Founding Fathers also came to look outdated as the precepts of the Continental Realism tightened their grip in the Cold War years. Senator Joseph McCarthy was only the most extreme voice of the large chorus, claiming that the harsh realities of the international scene made traditional American concepts of civil liberties obsolete, partly because Senator McCarthy and others grossly overreacted in the 1950s. Scoffing at the hysterics of anti-communism became a favorite sport of American intellectuals, with many inspiring reflections on the courage of those who refuse, often at a considerable personal and professional calls to name names or otherwise cooperate with various congressional and state investigations. This was all very well and the abuses were real, but one must also remember that the communist movement was one of the great horrors of world history and responsible for untold suffering and uncountable millions of deaths. Furthermore, although historians have not yet and may never even work on the numerical proportions of significant numbers of American communists that in fact anything do in their power to assist in the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, the anti-communists noted that many members of the Communist parties in the United States and elsewhere were good-hearted social idealists motivated more by a genuine passion for racial and social justice than by any desire to build a Stalinist police states. This was true, and from the standpoint of evaluating the intention and motives of many honest American communists should not be forgotten. Nevertheless, the capacity of the communist ideology to capture some of the finest mind and the keenest consciousness of the day made communism more frightening and dangerous and disgusting, not less the ability to pervert the good that makes a bad thing worse. Even so, the idea that a mere membership in a political party, however poisonous or misguided, could bar an American citizen from certain professions or expose citizens to the loss of civil employment or the threat of criminal prosecution was a novel and repulsive innovation to the foreign and to every sentiment of the Bill of Rights. For the Cold Warriors, however, an expansive concept of civil liberties was one of the illusions of the Virginal Columbia had picked up of her covenant. Now that we have come of age, we would have to narrow our concepts of liberty at the same time that strengthened our state. Social and cultural factors also push the United States towards continental realism. The Anglo-centric was establishment that had long led the nation's foreign policy lost much of its power and influence during the Cold War years, and the new establishment that rose in its place lacked both the intuitive grasp of the Anglo-American tradition and the personal history of contact with British leaders that helped shape the old elite. Some of this shift reflected the growing egalitarianism of American life. As the descendants turn of the century, immigrants rapidly climbed the social and professional ladders in the post-World War II climate opportunity. Some reflected the changes in structure of American financial and corporate leadership as the power moved from a handful of firms based mostly on the Wall Street and as the rival regional financial and corporate power centers gained strength in the decades following World War II. Mass access to higher education in the 1950s created new cohorts of academics and foreign policy professionals whose personal backgrounds owned little to England and whose universal education drew less and less from the traditional British ideas of liberal education. The Cold War years were the years of accelerating British decline. When the sun never set on the British Empire, its policies and its history commanded a fascinating attention and respected envious Americans. The dignity and dull and declining Britain of the Cold War possessed a few such attractions for a rising American generation as the memories of Britain's greatness faded. Americans rarely thought any longer of British foreign policy as a source of inspiration. As the British sun set, the Russian star rose. Stalin's diplomacy had been the model of continental cynicism and guile. Its contemptuous dismissal of proper power, oh, the Pope, how many divisions has he got? Could serve as a strategic thinking of continental realism. The Stalin state, secretive, centralized, able to command and concrete and concentrate the full resources of a society in the service of international ambition and accountable to no public opinion, was, from a continental perspective, one of the most admirable equipped scorpions ever to scramble against the glass walls of the European bottle. No one ever appreciated the great power capabilities of the Soviet state better than American diplomats and policymakers who had to oppose it. It was a short step from a healthy respect for the Soviet power to the conclusion that the United States needed to imitate the Soviet strategic thinking. Increasing numbers of American policymakers found themselves taking steps as the Cold War dragged on. The shift from traditional American approach to foreign policy to continental realism was gradual and slow. Men like George I, Kennan, Dean Acheson, Walter Lippmann, and Averill Harriman helped ensure the values and priorities of the old approach continued to inform the foreign policy process through the 1960s. The influence of continental realism in American foreign policy did not peak until the Nixon and Ford administration, when as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger placed American foreign policy solidly on continental grounds. The Nixon and Ford administration represented the zenith of continental realism in American foreign policy. The international life was seen as moral free zones. On the one hand, the United States support any distasteful regime, bar none, in the interest of strengthening our global posture against the Soviet Union. Some will attack this bitterly when it applied to the regimes like Augusto Pinochet in Chile, applauded it when it led to the opening towards China and Nicolae Ceausescu, independent-minded yet bizarre, tyrannical Romania. As conservatives noted at the time, however, the Nixon-Kissinger approach also took the moral element out of the U.S.-Soviet rivalry. It was as if the United States and the Soviet Union were great powers like Prussia and Austria and could reach detente based on common interests while setting aside their philosophical differences, just as the Catholic Austria and the Protestant Prussia have done. From the standpoint of personal morality, it's needed to be emphasized that there's nothing in the record to suggest that Nixon and Kissinger weren't acting on the basis of shared convention on his desire to promote peace and happiness of the human race. The darkness was in their worldview, rather than their personal characters. They were conservative statesmen trying to safeguard the interests entrusted to them in a dangerous and hostile world. Given this worldview, the Vietnam was neither a moral crusade for the administration nor a moral disaster. It was a practical problem to be addressed in a pragmatic way. The United States will lose its prestige if it withdrew preconceptively, or was seen to lose, the war at the same time. It didn't matter much who would be running Vietnam in 10 years' time. The economic issues scarcely existed for the administration. For economic focused foreign policy, the slow erosion of the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchanges based on the American dollar would have been seen as a primary threat to United States interests and the health of the anti-Soviet coalition in 1969. A threat far greater than anything than Ho Chi Minh could ever assemble in the far-off jungles of Indochina. Under the Bretton Woods system established during the 1940s, the U.S. Federal Reserve System was the de facto central bank for all market economies. The United States could effectively control the monetary policies of all its allies and generally did so in the interest of the domestic American economy, often to the irritation of its partners. Had traditional ordinary American diplomats like Alexander Hamilton, Andrew Mellon, or Henry Monthureau have been directing policy, American foreign policy in the Nixon years would have been focused on either strengthening the Bretton Woods or mitigating the consequences of its fall. The solemn and oft-repeated U.S. pledges to our Cold War allies and trading partners redeemed paper dollars and gold at a fixed price at $35 ounce would have been far outrated the promises to Saigon. For the Nixon administration, this perspective seemed to have been too far-fetched to be seriously considered and much less adopted as the basis for American policy. The methods of Nixon's foreign policy was continental as the substance. Congress was frozen out of foreign policy as much as possible, and the administration attempted to withhold vital information about military and intelligence operations from the legislature responsible for funding them. Within the executive branch, power was concentrated to the unprecedented degree. As no more bureaucratic channels and departments were ignored, a small network of officials operated the real foreign policy of the United States. Nixon's concept of foreign policy required the personal direction of a single guiding mind, alter rather than a studio. The Nixon administration was not without its success. The opening to Beijing changed the global balance of power, making the U.S. victory in the Cold War more likely while reducing the chances of a direct U.S.-Soviet confrontation along the way. The Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement were brought to a welcome stability to the relations between the two superpowers. Nonetheless, what the administration Continental's approach to foreign policy was principally was a series of major train wrecks. Putting Vietnam ahead of the Bretton Woods led directly to the two costless failures of the Cold War. The final and glorious end to the American effort in Vietnam could not have been more humiliating had it been scripted in the Kremlin. The bitterness engendered by the prolongation of the war had not faded from American politics by the end of the century and posed one of the most serious obstacles to the Nixon successors as they sought to continue the Cold War. Similarly, the economic consequences of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the hastened improvised way in which they were handled inflicting lasting damage on the American economy and the U.S. relations with Western Europe and Japan. Nixon and Kitchener succeeded where Charles de Gaulle failed. On the subject of monetary policy, they united Europe against the United States. From the collapse of the Bretton Woods system to the present day, Europeans have buried all their differences, however bitter, and cooperated to win a greater monetary independence from Washington in the good times and bad. The consequences of the chaotic collapse of the system spread further. The inflationary wave set off the currency crash led to the oil price shocks and the economic stagnation in the 1970s, which has massive consequences for private investors and the national economies all over the world, undermining governments, exacerbating social conflicts, and setting the stage for further problems as the thorough debt crisis of the 1980s. Okay, I think I'm done here. That was absurd. I read Special Providence by Walter Rusher Mead of the Hudson Institute. It was a 2001 book where he describes four intellectual schools of thought within American foreign policy: the Hamiltonians, the Jacksonians, the Jeffersonians, and the Russellian idealist. I highly recommend the book. It's a good read, and he's a very concise and clear writer. And further on, he go into great detail and defended American exceptionalism as best he could in the book. So once again, I recommend the book, and I hope you guys have a great week, and God bless.